Okay, one bit of information that was up all year last year, something that I thought, well, maybe we better disclose that right now. Okay, it's up here. You missed class. It's your responsibility to obtain the missed content. Okay, is it something we talked about in class? Is it a homework assignment? Either of that type of content. Okay, you need to be responsible, and I'm going to ask for that, and we'll gladly accommodate you. Okay, so looking at what we see here with natural selection, it says organisms are constructed to meet the demands of their environment. So in this case, when we're talking about size of animals, okay, what did the, I don't know if you want to say host or I wouldn't say narrator, but some of the scientists that they discuss, what's true about insects? Okay, so they can grow bigger because of the oxygen content around the Carboniferous period. So one of the things that they could do to adapt to this type of size is are they large or small? Well, we already established that they're larger. So how's that possible? Well, nature selected them to grow larger because there's more oxygen in the atmosphere. So once I suppose you could say the late Jurassic and into the Triassic period, then moving forward at that time, now we're getting into oxygen content starting to diminish. So when that happens, insects tend to do what then? Because the reason for that is, how does respiration take place in certain arthropods, which insects are? How do they breathe? You can say some arthropods breathe with lungs, that is true, but they're not the type of active respiration that we see in a lot of the vertebrates. So these types of animals breathe passively. And what were those structures called? Anyone remember? That has something to do with it? Yes. So the spiracles are the external openings that lead to what? There are a whole bunch of networks of these. Because in humans, after air has entered the back of the mouth, it goes through this structure here, which is the what? Yeah, so it's tracheal tubes that are located all throughout different types of insects. So if the demands on that animal is to grow larger, well then the muscles have to grow larger. So when that happens, there's only so much space that's going to be available inside that body plan. So that's what they mean. The muscles would squeeze out any availability to grow larger with the oxygen content starting to go down. So that's an example. That's what nature had selected. On the other hand, nature can select animals to get smaller. Why is that? So insects could grow larger than smaller, but we saw an example yesterday about animals who grew smaller. It was on an island. It was what? Well, they adapted, but it was an elephant. It was called a house elephant. That's true. Okay, so when it comes to food sources, you may have to climb in elevation like those animals did. And the larger the animal is, the more difficult it is to obtain that food source. So eventually, they're just unstable. It cannot climb any further. Okay, so moving on. These are the observations that we said we would start discussing. It says Darwin's theories, but it is these observations. And it's amazing what not necessarily the environment, I suppose you could say that, or Mother Nature, weather, which would include Mother Nature as well. If we think back to last June, what might stick out in your minds when you talk about the entire month of June? Very rainy, or a lot of precipitation had fell. And when that happens, when we're talking about insects, what was horrible the entire month of June? Mosquitoes were awful, okay? So one of the things that we could say, whether it is a mammal or whether it's an arthropod, these populations can fluctuate in size, okay? So when that happens, another example that we talk about is maybe a clutch size of maybe birds. I don't know when they try to track or get an idea of the pheasant population. I don't know if that takes place in the spring, maybe. So when we talk about clutch sizes, what are we specifically discussing? It's offspring, but it's usually not associated with mammals. It can, but a clutch size, we're talking about egg-laying animals that do that, okay? So with that being said, of course, birds aren't the only animals that lay eggs. There's still reptiles that do that. So a clutch size of, let's say, alligators or crocodiles, okay? If you had to guess, how many eggs would a female alligator possibly lay in its clutch? Now, there's no way, oh gosh, no, you're not supposed to know that because you haven't been taught that, but your best guess would be what? More than 6, and it's more than 20, so probably between 20 would be a low end, and I would think it'd be somewhere averaging around 50, okay? So when we talk about every female alligator or crocodile laying 50 eggs, according to this, do all of those offspring, are they going to survive to reproduce according to this? No, because if that was the case, if all of those offspring did survive to reproduce, you'd have these animals all over the place, okay? So that is an example if we talk about observation 1. Now, it could be loss of habitat, but in this case, it's probably cannibalism that these animals don't live to reproduce. It could be Uncle Jerry decides to have a meal and starts to eat the clutch size of his brother and their kids. That's just an odd behavior of certain reptiles. And it's not just reptiles. Mammals do that as well. And you could say that's anthropology. But anyway, for anyone who's seen The Lion King, the cartoon version, what's the social structure for lions? They're not solitary animals. They live in what's called a pride, okay? So the story of the Lion King that follows along, what happens to Simba? Yeah. Well, he gets trampled because his brother, Scar, right, decides to let him go and fall down into the canyon or whatever where the wildebeest trample him to death. But in that case, then what happens is now Scar takes over the pride, okay? So that's a different form of cannibalism, I would say, is getting rid of some of your competition. In this case, it was his brother. Okay, so these populations will fluctuate in size. Probably a really good example of that is between foxes and maybe rabbits, okay? If there is an abundance of rabbits, that means there's a lot of food to go around. Then what happens to the population of foxes? That's going to go up because there's plenty of food to certainly consume. But should a type of illness get into a rabbit population and wherever it is that these foxes may live, the rabbit population crashes, then what happens to the foxes? Or whatever it is that's preying upon them. They could possibly die out too because there's nothing available to eat. So that's observation 2, as you can see, that these will fluctuate in size. And probably the most easy to understand observation is certainly number 3. Okay? And what we mean by that is, okay, when it comes to that of evolution and natural selection, food and habitat are probably the biggest source, okay, or driver of evolution. One of the things that we were talking about in first hour, okay? Anybody have some, let's say, you can say phobias or different types of fears. One of the things that we talked about was snakes and or spiders. Does that affect anybody in here? Because some people say, well, I'm not going to pick up that spider. If spiders are just, they're awful. I do not care for spiders. Okay? Some people might say snakes. Oh, snakes, they really bother me. Okay? Well, whether you believe that a climactic shift is taking place with weather or temperature, which, yeah, the temperatures probably are getting warmer, which means that a lot of tarantula species that are mainly found in Mexico, Texas, Arizona, are starting to make their way further and further north. They're found in now as far north as Colorado, so I suppose you could say, I don't know if they're in Kansas, but I suppose Oklahoma, and my geography isn't the best, but the idea of having animals like that around, would that really bother you? Obviously, we have one who says yes if we don't like spiders, but... And we're not talking about just a few animals at all. We're probably thousands of these, okay? So when you have a lot of animals in a condensed area, there's only so much food, there's only so much shelter for these animals. So that ties into what we just said. To me, this first inference, okay, is talking about these examples of food and habitat or shelter. That's why observation number 3 is such a driving force for evolution. Okay. So then what happens is we lead to, there's 5 observations and 3 inferences. So this was, as you can see, the first one. Move on to, oops, that's too far. Now why is it doing this? There we go. So one of the things that can happen, and this is just the best example, that say, well, horses look a lot alike, which yes, they probably do. But one of the aspects I like to look at is that of zebras. Does anyone think they might know why? Why would zebras want to mainly congregate all together in one spot? Yeah, there's going to be strength in numbers as far as predators, that's true. But well, it has something to do with their stripes. What about them? What happens if you look at a pattern that is, you could say, gray and red, or in this case, black and white? If you stare at that long enough, what happens, do you think? Yeah, they're going to start to blend together, and you can't see it. So it's a type of rudimentary camouflage. So when you look at this, okay, it's not, we don't have an entire poster of this. I think it's a little bright, but you kind of get the idea. Okay, and just the stripes on these zebras, you can see, I was just looking at this, just below the eye, it's got a stripe that goes like this, and then this one, it doesn't have anything like that, either one of those. Okay, it might be fairly similar, but some of them are wider, some of them are more narrow. So it's just a way for these animals to blend in with one another. So nature would select them to do that. So no two individuals look exactly alike. Now in human terms, that could be, it's kind of a gray area, especially when you're talking about identical twins. Okay, so sometimes yes, sometimes no, but I think everyone here probably has a pretty good idea of how to keep track or tell the difference between identical twins. Okay, there's no question in your mind, you know which is Jack and which one's Jace. So even if they were exact, I know they're called identical twins, but how else could you tell the difference between the two?
Their names.
Besides their names.
Their clothes that they're wearing.
How they act.
Yeah, because how they're going to interact with other people. That's probably a different way that you can tell the difference between individuals. Then that leads to the inference 2 and 3. We want to get through these, and then we're going to get back to where we left off with yesterday with discussing the size of animals. So one of the things that I think is unique about adaptations, and whether you could say evolution or not, okay, since this is not random, we always like to pass along the idea of organisms can flourish or be successful because of their size and their strength. That's one way. What might be another way that an animal can survive that's not tied to its size or strength? Well, yes and no. You can survive by being intelligent too, or clever. You could say some animals, they flourish and are able to be successful because they are certainly clever animals. So since it's not random, it could be because of size, strength, and also intelligence. Okay, so then I think there's one more, and then we'll get back to talking about size of animals. I think it's this one. Yes, then that will be it for today for writing down. Hopefully, I don't think you have to write all of this. Maybe it's just the first two. Maybe that's in there. Maybe it isn't. So as we look at that bottom dash or bottom point, geographical separations can certainly cause speciation. And one way you could look at that is, could a grizzly bear survive north of the Arctic Circle? I mean, there's probably no natural predators, okay? Nothing preying upon a grizzly bear. So it certainly has its size for an advantage. But it's probably not common to, I guess my geography isn't very good. Maybe even northern Alaska, maybe that's north of the Arctic Circle. But for our purposes, when we talk about temperatures that drop that cold because of the Arctic Circle, it's not a grizzly bear that comes to mind, but rather what? Yeah, a polar bear. So those two types of animals, they're certainly related because not only they just have bear in their name, polar bear, grizzly bear, but how could we say that those have to be two different types of species? Because when you're looking at them, you're going to say, well, I know that's not a polar bear because of there's two things with its fur. One, it's white, and then not only is it going to be thick, but then so would their skin because of a layer of fat tissue, okay? So it's not that a grizzly bear can't survive up there, but there's going to be an advantage that polar bear has that the grizzly bear does not, that we just discussed. It doesn't have temperature, but with its size. But why is being white going to be, having white hair, going to be an advantage for that polar bear?
Prey won't see.
Right, because it's going to be easier to, I wouldn't say sneak up on animals, but when they're out doing their predation, it's easier for them to maybe, again, grab a fur seal or whatever it is that they're preying upon. A brown bear / grizzly bear is not going to have that opportunity because of course, their coat isn't going to blend in with the white snow. Okay, so we're going to end this portion of the presentation right here, and I'll start the next one, and that we're utilizing for part of this content from the History Channel. So here ends part A. Part B will begin shortly.